It was 1993, and I was sound asleep in bed, and I woke up and I heard a jet. From my bed, I could see out the window quite clearly, and I could see a bright blue, like orb, bright light, just glowing in the sky, and moving at a constant speed, kind of staggering a bit as it went along, and right behind it was something else chasing it. I got up to go to the window to take a better look. So Jilly said, "It's not what you think. You can hear the engines." But the engines were the sound of the F-18 chasing this arc welder blue object through the sky. And as it got higher up and higher up, I kept dipping down more and more, looking underneath, trying to see it as long as I could, and it disappeared, and the jet disappeared too, following it. So I went back to bed, and I laid there for a bit, and then I heard the engines again. And it had that sound that just like that he was really pouring on the coals. I saw the object again, and there it was, bright, bright blue. It was really bright. And it was sort of wobbling, and the jet was chasing it, and then all of a sudden it skipped like a rock on water, and then stopped, just like stopped, and just went boom, just did this big bright blast of blue-white light, which lit up the whole inside of the room, and probably the entire area in Granada Hills where I was living. It was like daylight, or even brighter, and then it was gone. I lay there in bed, and I watched as the jet slowly turned and started heading back, and it went behind the tree line, and that was the last of that. The next morning we sat at the dining room table. My mother-in-law was visiting from the UK, as she often did yearly. She was sitting at the table, and she kind of looked at us funny and said, "What was all that commotion? What was that noise? What were those people talking to you in the shop?" Now, I had the shop attached to my house that was once an attached three-car garage, but it had been converted into a workshop. It was a beautiful place. I did a lot of my movie work there. And she was referring to that because she was staying in the room right next to it, and she could hear me talking to people back there. I looked around, and I looked at Jilly, and she looked at me, and she narrowed her eyes like, "Don't you say a thing." And I didn't. And that was the last we ever spoke of that evening. But I'll never forget that night, not as long as I live, because that was the first time my late wife saw something she couldn't explain. And when her mother said, "What was the commotion in the back room? Who were you talking to?" that was the real clincher. She knew something was up, despite her skepticism. It was 1971, and I had a girlfriend that lived in Davis, California. We had met in San Mateo, going to the same college in the local area where I lived. But she got accepted to Davis and moved up there, so I would go up and visit her quite often. On one night, around 11 o'clock, I left her apartment to come back to the Bay Area. I was living in Pacifica, California. It was about an hour drive. So I drove down the 101, and as I was driving down the 101, I started getting really sleepy. I mean, it was weird. It was almost like I was being drugged. It was like poured on me, and I kept trying to keep myself awake, and I just kept fighting and fighting and fighting it. And then eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I started hearing voices, and the voices were talking to me, and they were like echoing in my head. And I was being urged to pull over, and I knew I had to, because what was going on was dangerous. I'm driving my Alfa Romeo sports car, just a little two-seater, and so I pulled off to the road, off to the side of the road, at a frontage road. I found an exit. It was all dark there. There was no structures. There was no buildings. There was nothing. And I pulled into this area where I could pull off the road into the dirt, into the bushes, and just park. I turned off the lights, and I tried to get some sleep. Now, sleeping in a two-seater Alfa Romeo is not an easy thing to do. I laid across from my driver's seat to the passenger seat and tried to sleep, but it was miserable. I'd close my eyes, they'd open again, and I just said, this is just not working. I closed them one more time, and the next thing I knew, there were lights shining at my eyes. I opened them up, and I saw what I thought were men standing there. I thought they might be highway patrol. I thought they might have been police officers. I wasn't sure because it wasn't very clear. And that was the last thing I remember. I woke up in a panic and I said, I gotta get out of here. I gotta get out of here. So I started the car. I got back on the freeway and I drove like a bat out of hell, crossed the Oakland Bridge. And as I'm going across the Bay Bridge, also the Oakland Bridge, there's a sign that I always looked at when I'd come back from Maryland's. That was my girlfriend's name. And it had a clock on it. Now, normally it takes about an hour to get back from Davis to that point. And I had left at 11 o'clock. And yeah, I pulled over to sleep, but I just couldn't sleep. And I mean, maybe I was out 15 minutes or so. I mean, that's what it felt like. But I looked up at the clock, it said 2:15. I was perplexed because from those days, I didn't know. I knew I saw UFOs and I had been seeing them since I was a kid. I never connected the dots, as many of us didn't until we saw the book Communion. So years later, I meet a Bond Smith and we do a regression on that night. And what happened was the men that came up to the car and shined the lights on me, they weren't men. They were beings, they were visitors, they were grays, whatever they were what I was used to seeing years later in my life. I was led out of the car into the dark where an object sat on the ground. It was saucer shaped, there was an open doorway on it, and it was very dimly lit, and I was led inside by one of the creatures all the way down the hallway and into a room that was like a gallery of fish tanks, except in those tanks were small babies. I'll never forget it. They looked human. They really didn't look odd at all, but there was something different about them. Maybe it was a feeling. Maybe it was their eyes were a little bit different, but they were closed. And she told me that this was very important, that this was important for us, it was important for you, it was important for the human race, and that somehow these babies came out of us. So I was led down another hallway and was taken into a dome-shaped room. Once inside the dome, it started to dim down and get dark, and all the stars came out, and I found myself in the middle of galactic space, meaning that all around me were galaxies. I've never seen anything like this before. She asked me, "Can you find your Earth now? Where's all the hatred, the wars, all the troubles that you've brought upon yourself on Earth?" And I thought to myself, from this perspective, they have vanished. It was like they didn't matter at all anymore. And I couldn't help but think that more human beings need to experience this before they come back home, so they can look at life from a different perspective, and maybe they'll stop hating, and maybe they'll stop having wars, and maybe realize that they're connected to such grandness instead of fighting each other and killing each other, because they just don't know. And this is what she was trying to impart on me. It was about 1992, and I woke up at 3 in the morning. Surprise, surprise, huh? And I was really thirsty. I'm a bit disoriented, and I don't know if it's just because I was dreaming heavily or if something had actually happened. I got the feeling it did. I got out of bed. My wife was still asleep, and I went down the hallway and into the kitchen. And there before me stood a very strange sight. A big butcher block we had, got a thick wooden top with long legs on it, was parked right in front of the refrigerator door. And I thought this was really odd, because who would do that? It wouldn't be her daughter, and it wouldn't be her. I mean, maybe, but it just seemed so odd. As I got closer to it and I was looking down at the legs, they started to move. And this kind of startled me because butcher blocks don't move their legs. But this one did. The next thing I knew, I was staring face to face with one of the visitors. So there she was, looking at me right in the eyes. We had this moment, and I mean, a million things went through my mind, and I thought, I gotta ask her some questions or anything. And then she just sort of looked at me and went, and then she just shot through the refrigerator, and I ran into the living room hoping to catch her, but I didn't. You just don't forget a moment like that. It was the most amazing thing because I was conscious, and it was as real as this. And she was really there. And no one else knows it but me. So I go back to the bedroom and I look at my late wife laying in bed, and I think to wake her and tell her about it. But I never did. And I never did a session about that night with Yvonne Smith. But it was one of those moments that was so spectacular because this wasn't something I remembered under hypnosis. She was standing there right in front of me, as real as this. And it was just incredible. And I didn't feel any fear. I didn't feel any stress. I didn't feel that she was afraid. It's an indescribable moment. But it would happen again in the future. And we'll talk about that next time.